The most inbred daughters of Mississippi. So profound was the tragedy that it gave birth to whispered legends of living ghosts, legends that haunt the collective memory of Sunflower County to this very day. It was in the sweltering summer of 1963, deep in the isolated backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, that a discovery was made, a discovery that would forever change how local medical professionals understood the devastating consequences of genetic isolation. That Tuesday morning was something Sheriff Thomas Blackwell would never forget. The humidity hung thick in the air as his patrol car bumped along the dirt road leading to the remote Holloway property. He was responding to a report from a concerned, traveling pastor who had stumbled upon something deeply disturbing during his rural ministry rounds. In county records, Blackwell later testified, "I've been sheriff in these parts for 17 years. I've seen all manner of human suffering, but nothing prepared me for what I found on that forgotten homestead. Oh, girls. They barely looked human." Nearly 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, the Holloway farm sat nestled between cypress swamps and cotton fields. What authorities discovered there would become the most documented case of familial intermarriage in all of Mississippi's state records. It was 3 generations of progressive genetic decline, a decline culminating in the birth of 4 daughters who would later become known in medical literature as the Holloway sisters. Called to the scene was Dr. Martha Simmons, the county's only female physician at the time. The first clinical documentation of the sisters' condition comes from her detailed notes, preserved in the University of Mississippi Medical Archives. Subject A, Eliza, 19, presents with severe microcephaly, pronounced facial asymmetry, and limited verbal capacity. Subject B, Mary, 17, exhibits similar cranial malformation with the addition of polydactyly on both hands and severe spinal curvature. Subject C and D, Ruth and Rebecca, 15. Identical twins display the most extreme manifestations, a near-complete lack of cognitive function. Their physical development arrested at approximately age 7, with translucent skin revealing a visible network of blood vessels that gives them a ghostly power. What made the Holloway case particularly significant in medical history was not just the severity of the deformities, but the clear documentation of how each generation of intermarriage produced increasingly severe outcomes. An alarming pattern of unions between first cousins, uncles, and nieces, and eventually siblings was revealed by county records, church registries, and family Bibles recovered from the property. To understand how such a situation developed and persisted, historical context is crucial. First settling in Sunflower County in 1887, the Holloway family established a largely self-sufficient homestead in one of the most remote areas of the Delta. The family was further isolated by economic hardship during the Depression years, which severed already tenuous connections to nearby communities. By the early 1940s, the Holloways had effectively withdrawn from wider society, creating their own insular world with its own rules and customs. Neighboring families either moved away during the Great Migration northward or learned to avoid the increasingly strange and hostile Holloways. This isolation was enforced with violent determination by the family patriarch, Jeremiah Holloway. A paranoid and controlling figure who viewed outsiders with extreme suspicion was how local stories described him. His son Elijah was raised in this atmosphere of fear and isolation, educated only through biblical teachings as interpreted by his father. When Elijah reached adulthood, the pool of potential spouses was limited to his first cousin Sarah, who lived on the property with her mother, Jeremiah's sister. Their union produced 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. These children, Isaac, Martha, and Joseph, grew up knowing only their immediate family and the boundaries of the Holloway land. What happened next is documented in painful diary entries from Martha, entries discovered hidden beneath floorboards in the main house. The siblings, with no exposure to social norms outside their family unit, formed romantic attachments. It was Isaac and Martha who became parents to the 4 daughters who would eventually come to medical attention. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't find these documented historical cases of genetic isolation and their devastating consequences anywhere else. These are the untold American stories, stories that shaped modern medical understanding of heredity yet remain hidden from mainstream history books. The isolation of the Holloway homestead wasn't merely geographical. A world frozen in time is revealed in photographs recovered from the property, photographs now preserved in the State Historical Society archives. The main house, built in the late 1800s, had never been modernized. There was no electricity, no running water, and no telephone lines. Long shadows were cast by kerosene lamps across walls covered with yellowing newspaper clippings and biblical verses handwritten on scraps of paper. The Holloway case represents a perfect storm of geographical, economic, and psychological isolation, explained Dr. William Harris, who studied the case extensively for his 1972 paper on rural genetic disorders. What we observed was essentially a closed genetic system operating across 3 generations, a system the consequences of which became increasingly severe with each subsequent birth. The family's seclusion was reinforced by the unique geography of their chosen homestead. Situated in a bend of a minor tributary of the Sunflower River, the property was naturally cut off from easy access. With swampland forming a natural barrier on 3 sides during spring flooding, the property became an island, completely inaccessible except by boat. Local postal records indicate that mail delivery to the property ceased in 1944, the year the rural route carrier reported being threatened at gunpoint by Jeremiah Holloway. School attendance records show that none of the 3rd generation of Holloways ever enrolled in the county school system. How such extreme isolation could go unnoticed is partially explained by the cultural context of the Mississippi Delta in this period. In the segregated South of the mid-20th century, government oversight of rural white families was minimal, with a cultural emphasis on privacy and self-sufficiency. The Holloways were simply considered peculiar folks who keep to themselves, according to interviews with elderly residents conducted in the 1970s. This isolation created the perfect conditions for genetic deterioration. Medical records indicate that by the time Isaac and Martha's first daughter was born in 1944, multiple recessive genetic disorders had become concentrated in the family line. These included rare metabolic disorders, skeletal malformations, and neurological conditions that would normally occur in perhaps 1 in several 100,000 births. A harrowing story of cumulative genetic damage is told by the progression of severity among the daughters. Eliza, the eldest, could speak in simple sentences and perform basic tasks. Mary could walk with assistance but possessed only rudimentary language skills. The twins, Ruth and Rebecca, never developed beyond the capabilities of toddlers and required constant care. Their unusual appearance is what made the twins particularly notable in medical literature. A combination of extreme albinism and exceptionally thin dermal layers created the ghostly translucence that would later inspire local folklore. Under certain lighting conditions, particularly in twilight hours, visible red-blue patterns were created across their faces and limbs by the blood vessels beneath their skin. When local children began reporting sightings of ghost girls in the woods surrounding the property in the late 1950s, most adults dismissed these as typical childhood fantasies. In retrospect, these were likely rare instances when the twins ventured or were brought beyond the property boundaries. A picture of a deeply dysfunctional family system was painted by the household structure revealed through Martha's diary entries and later investigation. Assuming his grandfather's role as the family patriarch, Isaac enforced isolation through fear and control. Martha, herself a product of first-cousin marriage, appeared to have developed a form of Stockholm syndrome, becoming both victim and enforcer of the family's separation from society. The daughters lived in a single room at the back of the house, sleeping on mattresses stuffed with corn husks. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. Their education consisted entirely of biblical recitation and practical skills like simple sewing and food preparation, though only Eliza possessed the coordination to perform these tasks with any proficiency. Local church records indicate that a Baptist minister, Reverend Thomas Wilson, attempted to visit the property in 1957 after hearing rumors about children in need. A disturbing entry is contained in his church log, visited Holloway Place today. Was met at the property line by a man with a shotgun who informed me that God's word is the only visitor welcome here. Deeply concerned about reports of children, will consult with sheriff. No follow-up action appears in county records until the fateful 1963 visit that finally exposed the situation. This 6-year gap highlights the challenges of social oversight in rural areas during this period, particularly for families who actively resisted outside contact. One of the most comprehensive case studies of consanguinity effects in American medical literature is provided by the medical documentation of the Holloway sisters. After their discovery in 1963, the sisters were transferred to the state hospital at Whitfield, where they underwent extensive examination by specialists from across the Southeast. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, a geneticist consulted on the case, documented her initial impressions. What makes this case particularly significant is not just the severity of each individual condition, but the clear pattern of genetic deterioration across siblings. The progression from the eldest to the youngest shows an acceleration of genetic abnormalities consistent with what we would expect from continued inbreeding. The medical files, partially declassified in 1987 under historical research provisions, revealed the sisters suffered from a constellation of rare recessive disorders. These included Seckel syndrome, bird-headed dwarfism, Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome characterized by polydactyly and heart defects, and a rare form of osteogenesis imperfecta that contributed to their fragile bone structure. Abnormal hemoglobin structures that compromised oxygen transport were revealed by blood work, explaining the bluish tint visible through their translucent skin. This combination of conditions had never been documented occurring simultaneously in a single family before the Holloway case. Varying degrees of cognitive impairment were revealed by the sisters' neurological evaluations. Eliza, with an estimated cognitive age of approximately 7 years, could communicate basic needs and even displayed a talent for simple melodies, often humming hymns she had learned from her mother. Mary could recognize family members and respond to simple instructions, but possessed virtually no abstract thinking capabilities. The most severe neurological impairments were presented by the twins, Ruth and Rebecca. Neither developed speech beyond occasional echolalia, repeating phrases without comprehension. They displayed notable hypersensitivity to light, keeping their eyes downcast or closed when outdoors, further contributing to their ghostly appearance and behavior in the rare instances they were seen by outsiders. Mary, the second eldest sister, formed a particularly strong attachment to one of her nurses at Whitfield, Mrs. Sarah Johnson. In one of the few recorded instances of the sisters speaking about their home life, Mary reportedly told Mrs. Johnson, "Mama said, we're special angels, not meant for outside. The light hurts Ruth and Rebecca, they cry when the sun comes. That's why we stay in the dark place." If you've made it this far into this haunting American tale, leave a comment saying, "The Holloway sisters deserved better." Your comment helps preserve these forgotten histories and ensures these medical lessons aren't lost to time. Crucial insight into how the family had rationalized the sisters' conditions and maintained their isolation was provided by this rare moment of clarity from Mary. Religious justification for keeping the severely affected children hidden from society was not uncommon in rural communities during this era, a time when disability was often viewed through a lens of divine punishment or testing. The best available care of the era was represented by the sisters' medical treatment at Whitfield, though by modern standards it would be considered woefully inadequate. Their physical conditions were largely addressed symptomatically, as the underlying genetic disorders were poorly understood at the time. The immediate focus of treatment was on nutritional deficiencies, dental issues, and various infections resulting from years of inadequate care. A marked improvement in their physical appearance within months of receiving proper nutrition and hygiene is shown in photographs from their time at Whitfield, photographs taken for medical documentation purposes. However, the underlying developmental and genetic conditions were permanent and largely untreatable. The behavioral observations are the most poignant aspects of the medical records. Extreme distress when separated from each other was displayed by all 4 sisters, necessitating their placement in a shared room despite hospital protocols. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. They had developed their own methods of communication, a combination of gestures, expressions, and vocalizations that staff described as a private language. A maternal role toward her sisters, particularly the twins, was assumed by Eliza, who often fed them and soothed their frequent distress at the unfamiliar hospital environment. Her singing to the twins at night when they became agitated was repeatedly mentioned in staff notes, the only reliable method of calming them. Dr. James Thornon, the psychiatric consultant assigned to the case, noted, "What we are witnessing is not merely the medical consequences of genetic abnormality, but the psychological impact of extreme isolation. These young women have never experienced normal socialization or stimulation. Their entire understanding of human interaction is limited to their immediate family unit itself, a unit that is deeply dysfunctional. The significance of the Holloway case in medical history cannot be overstated, coming just as the field of genetic counseling was emerging in the United States. Compelling evidence used in medical education throughout the following decades was provided by the extensively documented progression of genetic deterioration across generations and siblings. Shockwaves through Sunflower County were sent by the discovery of the Holloway sisters, an event that eventually garnered attention from national medical communities. The community's stunned reaction is revealed in local newspaper archives from the summer of 1963, with the Sunflower County Chronicle running the headline, "Family Secrets, Shocking Discovery on Isolated Farm Raises Serious Questions." The immediate legal consequences focused primarily on Isaac and Martha Holloway. County court records show that both were charged with multiple counts of child endangerment and neglect. Their case never went to trial, however, as psychiatric evaluations determined neither possessed the mental capacity to stand trial. Both were committed to separate psychiatric facilities, Isaac to the State Hospital for Men at Whitfield and Martha to the East Mississippi State Hospital. The profound impact of generational isolation and inbreeding on her own cognitive and emotional development was revealed in Martha's psychiatric evaluation, portions of which were later published in anonymized form in the American Journal of Psychiatry. The evaluating psychiatrist noted that Martha displayed a worldview entirely constructed within the confines of her family's distorted reality, with no concept of broader social norms or taboos. In one particularly revealing therapy session documented in her file, Martha reportedly stated, "Daddy always said, Holloway blood is special. Needs to stay pure. Outside blood makes weak children, but our girls are strong in spirit, even if their bodies aren't right. God made them special to test us." Crucial insight into the religious and pseudoscientific justifications that enabled the family's continued intermarriage is provided by this statement. Isolated from modern education and medical understanding, the Holloways had developed their own inverted logic about heredity, mistaking the progressive weakening of their genetic line for spiritual purification. From initial shock and revulsion to a more complex examination of how such a situation could have persisted undetected, the community response to the Holloway case evolved. Soul-searching among community members about collective responsibility is revealed in letters to the editor in the local newspaper. One particularly pointed letter from June 1963 asked, "Are we not all in some way responsible for what happened to those girls? We knew that family wasn't right. We told stories about them, made them into monsters in our children's imaginations, but not one of us thought to ensure those children were being properly cared for. Our silence made us complicit." New outreach programs specifically targeting isolated rural families were prompted by the case and implemented by the Mississippi Department of Public Welfare. The Holloway case was directly referenced in social worker training materials developed in 1964, though with names changed, as an example of how extreme isolation could mask serious abuse and neglect. The subject of local superstition became the property itself. Despite attempts by county officials to sell the land at auction, no buyers came forward. Reluctance to have any association with the cursed Holloway land was reported by local residents. By 1970, the buildings had fallen into disrepair, and the county eventually converted the property into a nature preserve, effectively erasing the physical evidence of the family's existence. Significant challenges to the state hospital system were presented by the sisters' long-term care, a system that was ill-equipped to provide appropriate support for their complex needs. Medical records indicate that by 1965, the decision was made to transfer them to the newly established Boswell Regional Center, one of Mississippi's first specialized facilities for individuals with developmental disabilities. In accordance with psychiatric recommendations that separation would cause significant trauma, the sisters were kept together at Boswell. The strong bonds between them were noted in staff reports from this period, with Eliza continuing to function as the primary caregiver for her more severely affected sisters despite her own limitations. The attention of medical researchers was attracted by the case, particularly as genetic science advanced through the 1960s and 1970s. Important subjects for understanding the effects of consanguinity became the Holloway sisters, with blood samples and genetic material preserved for study. This research contributed significantly to early genetic counseling protocols developed in the 1970s. Dr. Margaret Wilson, who studied the case extensively for her work on recessive genetic disorders, noted in a 1977 paper, "The Holloway case provides us with a rare, documented progression of compounding genetic abnormalities across generations of consanguineous unions." While ethical considerations now rightfully prevent observational studies of consanguinity effects, this historical case continues to yield valuable insights into the expression of recessive disorders. A powerful historical example of the biological and social consequences of extreme genetic isolation stands as the story of the Holloway sisters. Their lives, though largely spent within institutional care following their discovery, left a lasting impact on both medical understanding and the cultural memory of the Mississippi Delta region. The sisters' lives through the 1970s and early 1980s were tracked by medical records from Boswell Regional Center. Despite receiving the best available care for their conditions, their health outcomes varied significantly. Eliza, the eldest and least severely affected, adapted relatively well to institutional life. She eventually learned basic reading skills and participated in simple occupational therapy activities, according to staff notes. Mary's physical health remained relatively stable, though she never developed beyond very basic communication skills. The most significant health challenges continued to be experienced by the twins, Ruth and Rebecca, with frequent hospitalizations for respiratory infections and complications related to their underlying genetic conditions. The first of the sisters to pass away was Rebecca in 1976, following complications from pneumonia. Her identical twin, Ruth, who had never been separated from her sister, died 3 days later despite showing no obvious symptoms of illness. Medical staff noted this as a possible case of broken heart syndrome, though the fragility of her overall health was likely the primary factor. Mary lived until 1982, reaching the age of 36, far exceeding the initial medical projections at the time of the sisters' discovery. Eliza, showing remarkable resilience, lived until 1988, passing away at the age of 44. A notable entry from a staff member is included in her medical file. Despite everything, Eliza maintained a gentle spirit and often hummed to herself, especially in the evenings, the same hymns she once used to comfort her sisters. Well beyond their lives, the scientific legacy of the Holloway case continued. Invaluable resources for researchers became the blood samples and genetic material preserved from the family, especially as DNA analysis techniques advanced in the late 1980s and 1990s. While the sisters' identities were protected through anonymization, their genetic legacy contributed significantly to understanding the mechanisms of recessive genetic disorders. Preserved samples were used in a 1993 study published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics to identify specific recessive mutations that had accumulated in the Holloway lineage. This research helped develop more accurate genetic counseling protocols for communities where consanguineous marriage remained common. Culturally, the Holloway story transformed from recent tragedy to regional folklore with remarkable speed. By the 1970s, the ghost girls of Sunflower County had become a common element in local storytelling, often used as cautionary tales about the dangers of isolation and the importance of community oversight. Local historian Dr. James Coleman, who documented the evolution of this folklore in his 1991 book, *Delta Shadows*, observed, "What's fascinating about the Holloway legend is how quickly actual events were subsumed into the region's existing folkloric framework. The medical reality, albinism and translucent skin creating a ghostly appearance, transformed in public imagination into supernatural elements that reflected the community's need to process its own culpability through metaphor. Far beyond medical circles extended the educational impact of the case. By the 1980s, anonymized versions of the Holloway case study were being used in social work education throughout the Southeast as examples of how isolation can mask neglect and abuse, and how cultural deference to privacy must be balanced with child welfare concerns. Reclaimed by the Mississippi swampland that always threatened to engulf it has been the land where the Holloway homestead once stood. Largely fruitless have been occasional efforts by urban explorers or curiosity seekers to locate the original site, as nature has effectively erased most physical traces of the family's existence. However, In the archives of Mississippi's medical institutions and in the specialized literature of genetic counseling, the Holloway sisters' story remains an important case study in the consequences of genetic isolation. Their tragic lives ultimately served to advance understanding that has potentially prevented similar suffering for countless others. The case also prompted important discussions about the balance between family privacy and social responsibility, discussions that continue to resonate in child welfare policies today. As one social work educator noted in a 1995 retrospective on the case, the tragedy of the Holloway sisters wasn't just what happened to them, but that an entire community knew something was wrong and failed to act. Their story reminds us that true community means sometimes having difficult conversations and being willing to intervene when vulnerable individuals are at risk. If you've watched all the way through this haunting historical account, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end." This helps me get to know you and learn who truly appreciates the in-depth historical cases on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to uncover more hidden American histories. Hit the like button if this case study was informative, and share this video with anyone interested in the historical, medical, and social dimensions of America's most isolated communities. Each share helps ensure these educational histories aren't forgotten and the lessons they teach us about genetic science and social responsibility continue to make a difference. Today, the Holloway case is primarily remembered in two distinct contexts: as an important early documentation of progressive genetic deterioration in medical literature, and as a haunting reminder of how easily the vulnerable can be hidden away when communities choose not to see what's in front of them.